The Thaw family of Pittsburgh did not merely possess wealth, they possessed a sovereign immunity carved from coal and steel that placed them above the laws of God and men. Standing at the apex of the Gilded Age, they moved in the same atmosphere as the Carnegies and Mellons, wealthy enough to bend markets, intimidate rivals, and treat the law like a suggestion. Yet beneath the veneer of their European-style palaces and philanthropic endowments lay a biological and moral catastrophe that no amount of money could conceal. The heir to this limitless fortune, Harry K. Thaw, was not a prince of industry, but a morphine-addicted schizophrenic who prowled the underbelly of New York with the appetite of a predator. He was a man who reportedly lit his cigars with $100 bills, not merely to burn money, but to broadcast a darkness within him that craved domination. Known in the hushed whispers of the brothels as the sadist, Harry found no pleasure in conventional romance. His sexual gratification was derived solely from the crack of a leather whip across the flesh of terrified young women, a perversion he funded with his father's millions. This grotesque legacy culminated not in a boardroom triumph, but in 3 gunshots fired on a rooftop theater, a public execution that exposed the Thaw dynasty as a gilded cage housing a monster. How the Thaw fortune was built. The geological strata of the Thaw dynasty were formed not in the glitter of high society, but in the suffocating sulfurous gloom of mid-19th century Pittsburgh. This was a city that resembled a functioning diagram of hell, a place where the sun was routinely blotted out by noon under a thick blanket of bituminous coal smoke. In this crucible of iron and soot, William Thaw built the engine that would eventually power the most notorious murder of the new century. He was a man of cold, hard arithmetic, born in 1818 to a father who was a meticulous bank clerk. But where John Thaw saw the world in balanced ledgers, William saw it in lines of transit. He possessed a forensic understanding of logistics that bordered on clairvoyance, recognizing early on that the true master of the industrial age would not be the man who mined the coal or smelted the steel, but the man who controlled how it moved. William Thaw began his ascent in the rough and tumble world of river transport, partnering with his brother-in-law, Thomas Shields Clark, to dominate the canal systems of Pennsylvania. They commanded a fleet of steamboats and effectively held the keys to the Ohio Valley. However, William Thaw separated himself from his peers through a ruthless ability to pivot. While his competitors were doubling down on the slow romantic age of water transport, Thaw saw the future written in the steam and iron of the locomotive. In a masterstroke of timing that business historians still study with awe, he liquidated his canal interests just moments before that market collapsed, pouring his capital into the nascent, chaotic world of railroads. This decision was the genesis of the true Thaw empire. William became the architect and the second vice president of the Pennsylvania Company, a massive holding entity designed to manage the western interests of the Pennsylvania Railroad. This was not merely a transport company, it was a geopolitical weapon. By controlling the rail lines that fed into the heart of Pittsburgh, Thaw effectively controlled the metabolic rate of the American steel industry. The mechanism of his power was absolute and terrifyingly simple. If a steel baron wanted his coal delivered or his beams shipped to the expanding cities of the West, he paid the toll to William Thaw. He sat at the choke point of the Industrial Revolution, extracting a percentage of every ton of metal that built the bridges and skyscrapers of a growing nation. When power turned into protection, this logistical chokehold generated wealth at a rate that is difficult to comprehend in modern economic terms. By the time the empire reached its zenith, William Thaw had amassed a personal fortune estimated between $40 and $50 million. Adjusted for the economic power parity of the era, this placed the Thaws in the same rarefied atmosphere as the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts. They were American royalty, untouched by the laws that governed common men residing in a fortress-like mansion on Pittsburgh's Millionaires' Row. Lyndhurst, as the estate was known, stood as a monument to their dominance, a castle of stone rising above the grime of the city, filled with European art and staffed by an army of servants who moved in silent fear of the patriarch. However, the foundation of this castle was built on a fault line. William Thaw lived two distinct contradictory lives. His public persona was that of the benevolent patriarch and civic saint. He poured millions into the Allegheny Observatory, funded scholarships at prestigious universities like Harvard and Princeton, and patronized the arts with a lavish hand. He polished the family name until it gleamed, using charity as a solvent to wash away the ruthless, predatory tactics of his business dealings. He desperately wanted to be remembered as a man of science and culture, a titan who uplifted his city. But within the walls of Lyndhurst, a toxic dynamic was festering, one that would eventually undo everything he had built. The root of the eventual collapse can be traced directly to William's second marriage. After the death of his first wife, he married Mary Sibbett Copley. Mary was significantly younger, socially ambitious, and possessed a maternal instinct that was fierce yet completely devoid of discipline. While William's children from his first marriage were raised with the stern Calvinist work ethic of his early leaner years, the children of the second marriage, specifically his son, Harry Kendall Thaw, were raised in a gilded cage of absolute indulgence. William Thaw, by then an aging titan exhausted by the demands of his empire, was too tired or too distracted to discipline the volatile progeny of his second union. He observed the disturbing behaviors of young Harry, but chose the path of least resistance. The forensic record of Harry's childhood reads like a textbook case of early onset psychopathy, aggravated by a complete lack of boundaries. The boy suffered from chronic insomnia, screaming through the night until he was sedated with opiates, a common medical practice of the time that likely sowed the seeds of his later devastating addiction. He had a pronounced stutter that fueled a violent temper, creating a feedback loop of frustration and rage that manifested in horrifying ways. Harry's behavior went far beyond the typical tantrums of a spoiled child. He would fly into black rages, hurling heavy porcelain vases at servants, destroying antique furniture, and displaying a specific chilling cruelty towards animals. He was known to trap small animals and torment them, a classic marker in the forensic triad of sociopathy. Yet instead of correction, he received concealment. A responsible father might have sought institutional help or imposed rigorous discipline. William Thaw did neither. Instead, he and Mary established the family's default response for decades: pay, silence, move on. When Harry was expelled from private schools for immoral conduct or violence, William used his influence and his checkbook to buy his son's way into new ones. When Harry assaulted staff or caused public scenes, Mary paid the victims to remain silent. They taught their son that morality was a transaction and that consequences were for poor people. The vast wealth of the Pennsylvania Railroad was not used to cure the boy's madness. It was used to insulate him from reality, creating a bubble where his impulses were the only law that mattered. This dynamic created a prince of chaos. Harry grew up watching his father command the industrial world with a stroke of a pen, and he internalized the idea that his will was absolute. But unlike his father, Harry had no talent for business, no head for numbers, and no capacity for creation. He was pure-eyed, a creature of impulse backed by a credit limit that had no ceiling. He looked at the smoking chimneys of Pittsburgh not as a responsibility, but as a personal bank vault that would never run empty. As Harry entered adolescence, the mechanism of enablement escalated. He was admitted to the University of Pittsburgh and later Harvard, solely on the weight of the Thaw name. At Harvard, his behavior became even more erratic and debauched. He spent his time gambling, drinking, and obsessively pursuing chorus girls, flashing his wealth with a vulgarity that alienated the old money elites of Boston. He was eventually expelled, but the expulsion was framed by the family as a withdrawal due to health, a euphemism that maintained the facade of respectability while the rot deepened beneath the surface. William Thaw in his final years must have looked at his son with a mixture of horror and resignation. He had conquered the rivers and the rails, but he could not conquer the biology of his own air. He attempted to mitigate the damage in his will, structuring trust funds and limiting direct control, but he underestimated the blind determination of his wife Mary. The death of William Thaw in 1889 effectively removed the brakes from a runaway train. The patriarch's passing eliminated the only figure in the family who commanded even a shred of Harry's respect or fear. The funeral was a grand state affair in Pittsburgh, attended by the titans of industry, but as the coffin was lowered into the earth, the transfer of power began. The will left by William was a document of colossal wealth, but it contained a fatal error. He left the bulk of the estate's management and a significant portion of the liquid assets to Mary Copley Thaw, a woman who worshipped her son's destructive tendencies. Mary Copley Thaw is the silent villain of this first chapter. Upon her husband's death, she did not tighten the reins on Harry, she cut them entirely. She increased his allowance to levels that were astronomical for the time, thousands of dollars a month, equivalent to hundreds of thousands today. She funded his trips to Europe, where he would leave a trail of battered prostitutes and paid-off hotel concierges from London to Paris. She believed, with a delusion that matched her son's, that Harry was simply high-spirited and misunderstood by a jealous world. With the king of coal dead, the restraint vanished. The money that had been generated by the sweat of miners and the grinding of steel wheels was now in the hands of a young man who viewed the world as his personal torture chamber. The transition of power from the disciplined, ruthless father to the enabling mother and the sadistic son marked the beginning of the end. The Thaw fortune had been extracted from the earth to build a nation, but in the hands of the second generation it would be weaponized to destroy lives. The black power of Pittsburgh coal was about to be refined into a white-hot scandal. The dynasty stood at the precipice of the 20th century, armed with unlimited wealth and a complete absence of morality, ready to unleash its mad prince upon the unsuspecting metropolis of New York. 3 shots, 1 trial, and a family cover-up. The death of William Thaw unleashed a force upon the world that had previously been contained by the sheer gravity of his patriarchal authority. With the father gone and the mother, Mary Copley Thaw, holding the checkbook open, Harry Kendall Thaw was no longer a problem to be managed. He was a monster to be funded. The transition of the Thaw dynasty from the industrial production of coal to the industrial consumption of vice began in earnest during the 1890s as Harry embarked on a hedonistic rampage that would span 2 continents. He was a man armed with the emotional maturity of a toddler, the paranoia of a schizophrenic, and a bank account that rivaled the treasury of a small nation. This volatile chemical mixture created one of the most dangerous predators of the Gilded Age, a man who viewed other human beings not as autonomous souls, but as props in a play written for his own amusement. Forensic historians looking back at Harry's behavior during this period identify a clear escalation in his pathology. The cruelty towards animals that marked his childhood in Pittsburgh mutated into a terrifying sadism directed at humans. Harry did not travel to Europe for culture. He traveled for conquest. His grand tour was a trail of wreckage that stretched from the casinos of Monte Carlo to the brothels of London. In every city, the pattern was identical. Harry would arrive, flash obscene amounts of money, secure a private suite, and then hunt for victims. The mechanism of his interaction with the world was violence lubricated by bribery. In London, an incident occurred that should have ended his freedom, but instead confirmed his immunity. One often cited account alleges that in London, Harry assaulted a hotel boy behind closed doors, an episode that should have ended his freedom, but instead ended in hush money, lawyers, and a quiet exit from the country. This event established the template for his adult life: sin, pay, leave. The law did not apply to Harry K. Thaw, only the exchange rate did. Upon his return to New York, Harry attempted to insert himself into the high society of Manhattan. He craved acceptance from the old money elites, the Astors, and the Vanderbilts, but his reputation preceded him. He was viewed as crude, a Westerner with too much money and zero breeding. He was famously blackballed from the prestigious Knickerbocker Club, a rejection that festered in his mind and fueled a lifelong resentment against the gentlemen of New York, a resentment that would eventually fixate on Stanford White. Denied entry to the polite drawing rooms, Harry crowned himself the king of the Tenderloin, the vice district of Manhattan. Here, amidst the gambling dens and the high-end brothels, Harry reigned supreme. He became a legend of excess, a caricature of the playboy. He was the man who lit his cigars with $100 bills, a gesture that was widely reported in the tabloids as a sign of his wealth, a gesture that screamed contempt, not only for money, but for everything money could not buy him. He burned money because he hated what it couldn't buy him: respect. However, the playboy persona was merely a mask for the predator. Behind the closed doors of his bachelor apartments, Harry K. Thaw was decomposing. His mental instability was exacerbated by a voracious addiction to narcotics. He was a heavy user of laudanum and morphine, later graduating to cocaine. The drugs acted as an accelerant for his paranoid schizophrenia. Under the influence of morphine, his eyes would glaze over, his stutter would vanish, and he would enter a state of cold, dissociative calm. Under cocaine, he became a manic demon, convinced that the world was plotting against him. It was in this drug-fueled haze that his sexual sadism flourished. Harry Thaw was not interested in consensual pleasure. His desire was inextricably linked to the infliction of pain. He had a specific fetish for young virginal women, showgirls and models who were desperate for money and fame. He would lure them to his apartment with promises of expensive gifts or career advancement. Once the door was locked, the prince would vanish, replaced by the sadist. The forensic accounts of these encounters are harrowing. Harry kept a collection of whips, specifically dog whips, made of braided leather with weighted tips. He would force women to strip, then chase them around the room, slashing at their legs and backs until they bled. He derived sexual gratification from their screams and their terror. One notorious incident involved a young woman named Ethel Thomas. Harry rented a soundproof studio, stripped her, and beat her with a whip for hours. When he was finished, he simply opened his wallet. "Here is your medicine," he would say, handing over a stack of cash. The horror of this dynamic lies in the economics of the Gilded Age. For a working-class girl in New York, the $500 or $1,000 Harry threw at her after a beating represented years of wages. It was a life-changing sum. The mechanism of the payoff weaponized their poverty against their dignity. Harry knew that he could buy their silence because they could not afford to speak. He was purchasing their bodies, but he was also purchasing their justice. His depravity was not limited to private torture. It extended to public humiliation. Harry orchestrated one of the most infamous parties of the era, the Pie Girl Dinner. Held at a lavish restaurant, the climax of the evening featured a massive pie being wheeled to the center of the table. As the guests watched, a naked girl burst out of the crust, scattering pastry and birds. While some guests laughed, many were repulsed by the vulgarity and the objectification. It was a display of Roman decadence in the middle of Manhattan, a signal that for Harry Thaw, human beings were merely ingredients to be consumed. Yet despite his open monstrosity, Harry remained protected. His mother, Mary Copley Thaw, operated from the shadows as his chief enabler. She was aware of his indiscretions, though she likely refused to acknowledge the depth of his depravity. She maintained a phalanx of lawyers whose sole job was to clean up Harry's messes. They were the fixers of the Gilded Age, men who carried briefcases full of cash to police precincts and newspaper offices. They ensured that Harry's name was kept out of the police blotters, or that the stories were spun as youthful pranks. Mary poured millions into this containment strategy, effectively subsidizing her son's reign of terror. She believed she was protecting the family name. In reality, she was feeding a beast that was growing larger and hungrier with every meal. The tragedy of Harry K. Thaw during these years is that he was a man screaming for boundaries that no one would set. His violence was, in part, a test of reality. He pushed further and further, from beating animals to beating children to torturing women, subconsciously waiting for someone, anyone, to tell him no. But the answer from his world was always yes, provided the check cleared. This absolute lack of resistance fueled his narcissism and his paranoia. He began to view himself as a vigilante, a moral arbiter who was above the common law. He projected his own sickness onto others. He, the man who whipped women, began to obsess over the idea of purity. He became fixated on the concept of ruined women, developing a Madonna whore complex that would eventually lead him to Evelyn Nesbit. By the turn of the century, Harry K. Thaw was a ticking time bomb walking the streets of New York. He was armed, addicted, psychotic, and possessed of a belief that he was chosen by God to punish the wicked. He wandered the city at night, a wraith in a tuxedo, looking for a target that could absorb the limitless rage festering inside him. He had money, he had power, and he had a whip. All he needed now was a nemesis, a focal point for his madness. And just a few blocks away, in a studio filled with red velvet swings and Japanese kimonos, the most famous architect in America was unwittingly preparing to audition for the role. The collision course was set. The sadist was looking for a savior, but he would settle for a victim. The Devil's Triangle, Stanford White, Evelyn Nesbit, and the Obsession. The tragedy of the Thaw dynasty was not a solo performance. It was a deadly ensemble piece that required a specific alignment of three distinct archetypes: the predator, the prey, and the avenger. While Harry K. Thaw was prowling the vice districts of Europe, inflicting physical abuse on hotel staff and buying silence, a different kind of drama was unfolding in the artist studios of New York City. This drama centered on a young woman who would unknowingly become the fulcrum upon which the entire weight of the Thaw fortune would eventually crush down. Her name was Evelyn Nesbit, and in the forensic accounting of this crime, she stands as the first true casualty of the modern celebrity machine. Evelyn Nesbit was the original American supermodel long before the term existed. Born in 1884 in Tarentum, Pennsylvania, ironically, just miles from the smokestacks that forged the Thaw fortune, she was a creature of startling poverty-stricken beauty. After her father's death left the family destitute, her mother moved them to New York City, where Evelyn's face became their only currency. She was not merely pretty. She was an aesthetic phenomenon. Her copper hair, porcelain skin, and haunting, melancholic eyes captured the imagination of the Gilded Age. She became the muse for artists like Charles Dana Gibson, immortalized as the definitive Gibson girl. Her face was everywhere, on magazine covers, in advertisements for milk and soap, and sculpted into statues. She was the girl of the moment, a symbol of innocence and purity that the public adored. However, the commodification of Evelyn Nesbit drew the attention of men who collected beautiful things. Foremost among them was Stanford White. Stanford White was a titan. At 50 years old, he was the most celebrated architect in America, the partner in the legendary firm McKim, Mead, and White. He had designed the structures that defined New York's skyline: the Washington Square Arch, the New York Herald Building, and the magnificent Madison Square Garden. He was a man of immense appetite, enormous charisma, and boundless creative energy. Society viewed him as a Renaissance man, a jovial genius who built palaces for the rich. But the forensic profile of Stanford White reveals a darker architecture hidden behind the facade. He was a high-functioning predator, a man who used his wealth, status, and paternal charm to target young women from disadvantaged backgrounds, from poor backgrounds. White did not hunt in the alleys like Harry Thaw. He hunted in the open, using culture as his camouflage. He befriended Evelyn and her mother, playing the role of the benevolent papa. He paid for Evelyn's dental work. He sent her to school. He bought groceries for her struggling family. He cultivated a sense of profound indebtedness and trust. He invited Evelyn to his studio on West 24th Street, a place that was less an office and more like private space designed to impress and manipulate. The interior of this studio has become a fixture in the mythology of American crime. It was a space engineered for entrapment. The entrance was discreet, leading up a staircase to a wonderland of tiger skin rugs, Japanese lanterns, and red velvet drapes. But the centerpiece of this hidden apartment was the red velvet swing. Suspended from the high ceiling by red ropes intertwined with ivy, it hung in the middle of the room. According to historical accounts and court testimony, the red velvet swing was a notable feature in the studio. White would entertain young visitors, including Evelyn Nesbit, by pushing her on the swing during private gatherings. The defining moment of this dynamic occurred one night in 1901, when Evelyn was not yet legally an adult. Stanford White invited her to the studio for a late supper. According to Evelyn Nesbit's testimony in the 1907 trial, one night in 1901, when she was 16, Stanford White invited her to the studio for a late supper. He served her champagne, after which she lost consciousness. When she awoke the next morning, she realized she had been taken advantage of by White, a man she had trusted as a mentor. When she began to cry, White did not apologize, but instead used reassuring words to convince her that the situation was not something to feel ashamed of and was part of growing up. Despite the distress, she stayed in the relationship with him for about a year afterward. Evelyn, trapped by her poverty and her confusion, remained in his orbit, becoming his mistress for a year before he inevitably grew bored and moved on to a younger conquest. Enter Harry K. Thaw. Harry had watched Evelyn from afar, obsessing over her image on the magazine covers. To Harry, Evelyn was not a person. She was the ultimate collectible, a prize that would validate his existence and force New York society to respect him. He began a campaign of relentless pursuit. He sent her rooms full of roses. He bought tickets to every show she appeared in. He introduced himself as Mr. Monroe, hiding his identity until he could dazzle her with his wealth. Initially, Evelyn was repulsed by him. Harry was physically strange, with bulging eyes and a terrifying intensity. He lacked the suave charm of Stanford White, but Harry possessed the one thing Evelyn needed desperately: security. When Evelyn fell ill with appendicitis, Harry stepped in where White had stepped back. He paid for the best doctors, the private hospital suite, and her recovery. He played the role of the White Knight, slowly eroding her defenses with a siege of generosity. However, Harry's interest in Evelyn was not rooted in love. It was rooted in a pathological obsession with purity. Harry suffered from a severe Madonna whore complex. He needed Evelyn to be a virginal angel. He began to interrogate her relentlessly about her past. He was fixated on Stanford White. He referred to White as the Beast. He demanded to know every detail of their relationship. He would keep Evelyn up for nights on end, fueled by cocaine, screaming questions at her. Did he touch you? Where? How many times? Did you enjoy it? In 1903, Harry took Evelyn on a trip to Europe, a journey that would reveal the true depth of his madness. It was during this trip in Paris that Evelyn finally broke down. Under the pressure of his relentless interrogation and believing that the truth would make him pity and protect her, she confessed everything. She told him about the drugging, the rape, the blood on the sheets, and the red velvet swing. She expected comfort. Instead, she triggered a nuclear explosion in Harry's psyche. The confession confirmed Harry's worst paranoid delusion. The Beast, White, had stolen his property. Stanford White had ruined the only pure thing in the world. But forensically, Harry's rage was not on behalf of Evelyn's trauma. It was on behalf of his own ego. He was furious that he was second. He was consumed by a retroactive jealousy so potent that it fractured his mind. From that moment on, Stanford White ceased to be a rival and became a demon that had to be exterminated. The horror of the European trip culminated at the Schloss Katzenstein, a remote castle in the Austrian Tyrol that Harry rented. The setting was Gothic, a stone fortress isolated by dark forests. Here, the White Knight mask slipped off completely, revealing the sadist beneath. One morning, Harry woke Evelyn up early. His demeanor had changed. His eyes were glazed, his manner cold and dissociative. He ordered her to strip. When she hesitated, he tore her clothes off. He produced a dog whip, a heavy braided leather scourge he had brought from London. He proceeded to beat her savagely. The forensic account of this beating is gruesome. He struck her repeatedly across the back, legs, and buttocks, flaying her skin until the blood ran down her legs. He stopped only when he was exhausted. After the beating, the mechanism of the Thaw pathology reasserted itself. Harry fell to his knees, weeping, kissing her feet, begging for forgiveness. He claimed that the madness had taken him over, that he had to punish her to purify her of Stanford White's touch. He cared for her wounds with the tenderness of a nurse applying salves to the cuts he had just inflicted. This cycle, torture followed by worship, locked Evelyn into a trauma bond. She was terrified of him, yet she was dependent on him. She was thousands of miles from home, penniless and isolated in a castle with a maniac who controlled her passport. Why did she stay? Why, in 1905, did she agree to marry him? The answer lies in the brutal economics of her survival. Stanford White had discarded her. Her reputation in New York was compromised. She was a poor girl with a famous face but no future. Harry Thaw offered her a contract. He would provide her with millions, he would take care of her mother, and he would give her the respectability of the Thaw name. In exchange, she had to belong to him completely. She had to renounce Stanford White. She had to feed Harry's obsession with hatred. Evelyn Nesbit married Harry K. Thaw on April 4th, 1905. It was a deal with the devil. She believed she was securing her future. In reality, she was stepping into the center of a killing jar. By marrying Harry, she validated his ownership. She became the justification for his violence. Harry now had a legal and moral mandate to avenge his wife's honor. The marriage certificate was not a declaration of love. It was a death warrant for Stanford White, trapped between two monsters, traumatized and silenced. And you had the avenger, Harry, a drug-addicted sadist who had convinced himself that murder was not a crime, but a divine duty. The pressure in this closed system was building with every passing day, fueled by Harry's cocaine, Evelyn's tears, and the oblivious arrogance of Stanford White, who continued to dine at the finest tables in New York, unaware that a bullet with his name on it was already chambered in the mind of the man watching him from the shadows. The night at the Garden, the public execution. The final collision between the madness of Harry K. Thaw and the arrogance of Stanford White was destined to occur not in a private alleyway, but on a stage. For a pathology as performative as Thaw's, a murder committed in the shadows would have been a failure. He did not merely want to kill the beast. He wanted to exorcise him before the eyes of the very society that had rejected Harry and embraced the architect. The venue for this ritualistic slaughter was chosen with a cosmic sense of irony, Madison Square Garden. This was not the concrete arena of modern times, but the second iteration of the Garden, a Beaux-Arts masterpiece designed by Stanford White himself. It was a cathedral of pleasure, located at Madison Avenue and 26th Street, a complex that included the largest amphitheater in the world, a concert hall, and a rooftop theater that offered open-air entertainment to the sweltering city. Crowning the tower was a gilded statue of the goddess Diana, modeled after Evelyn Nesbit, a silent copper witness to the tragedy unfolding below. Stanford White had built this temple, he ruled it, and on the night of June 25, 1906, he would die in it. The atmosphere in New York City that evening was oppressive. A heat wave had settled over Manhattan, turning the streets into stifling canyons of humidity. The rich sought refuge on the rooftops, where the air was slightly cooler and the champagne was cold. Harry K. Thaw and Evelyn Nesbit began their evening at Martin's, an upscale French restaurant near the Garden. Contemporary accounts of this dinner suggest a scene thick with tension. Harry was dressed in a black tuxedo and a heavy, long black overcoat, a bizarre choice of attire for a summer night that signaled he was concealing something. His demeanor was manic. He was sweating profusely, his eyes darting around the room, his stutter pronounced. Stanford White was also at Martin's that night. He was dining separately, oblivious to the fact that his nemesis was watching him from across the room. White was 52 years old, exhausted, and visibly aged. The relentless pace of his hedonism and his work had taken a toll. He looked less like the Stanny of legend and more like a tired lion. When Harry spotted him, the mechanism of the obsession engaged. Harry stared at White with a fixated, predatory intensity. Evelyn later testified that Harry's face turned a terrifying shade of pale, his pupils dilated by the adrenaline of pure hate. He passed a note to the waiter, likely an inquiry or a threat that was never delivered. The proximity of the beast acted as a chemical catalyst on Harry's unstable mind. The Thaw party eventually moved to the Madison Square Garden roof garden for the premiere of a musical comedy titled Mam'zelle Champagne. The show was a forgettable, frivolous production described by critics as dull. The audience was a mix of high society and the demi-monde, the very people Harry desperately wanted to impress. Harry, Evelyn, and two male companions took their seats at a table near the back. Harry was agitated. He could not sit still. He paced the aisles, wandering between the tables like a specter. Then Stanford White arrived. The architect entered his own building late, around 11 p.m. He took a table near the stage, seating himself alone. He ordered a drink and watched the performance with a look of bored detachment. He was sitting in a position of total vulnerability, his back exposed to the room, secure in the belief that he was the king of this domain. He did not see the figure in the black overcoat moving through the shadows behind him. The forensic choreography of the murder is chilling in its simplicity. Harry K. Thaw did not rush. He stalked. He approached White's table with the deliberate, heavy steps of an executioner. He stood over the architect for a few seconds, unseen. The music from the stage, a song titled "I Could Love a Million Girls," provided a surreal, upbeat soundtrack to the impending violence. Harry reached into his heavy overcoat and withdrew a gold-plated pistol. The weapon itself was a symbol of Thaw's pathology. Expensive, flashy, and deadly. He extended his arm. Leveling the gun at the architect's head, he fired 3 times at point-blank range. Bang, bang, bang. The first bullet struck Stanford White in the left shoulder. The second bullet entered his mouth, shattering his teeth and lodging in the base of his skull. The third bullet struck him near the right eye, destroying the brain instantly. The violence was absolute. Stanford White did not scream. He did not fight. He simply slumped forward onto the table, his arm knocking over a glass of water. He then slid slowly to the floor, his face, the face that had defined American aesthetics for a generation, reduced to a ruined mask of blood and bone. He died instantly in the building he designed under the statue of the girl he had ruined. For a few seconds, the audience did not react. The sound of the gunshots blended with the noise of the orchestra. Many people believed it was part of the show, a dramatic sound effect or a prank. The actors on stage froze, but the band continued to play. Then the smell of gunpowder drifted through the humid air, mixing with the scent of perfume and cigar smoke. A woman screamed. The realization rippled through the crowd like a shockwave. Panic erupted. Chairs were overturned as hundreds of people scrambled for the exits, terrified that a maniac was on the loose. But Harry K. Thaw was not running. The performance was the point. After firing the shots, Harry did not flee. He did not try to blend into the crowd. He stood over the body, holding the smoking gun high in the air, transforming the murder weapon into a totem of victory. He broke the pistol open, ejecting the spent shells onto the floor, a gesture of finality. A fireman who was on duty at the theater rushed forward and grabbed Thaw. Harry did not resist. He was calm, almost euphoric. He looked the man in the eye and delivered the line that would become the headline of the century. "He ruined my wife. I did it because he ruined my wife." This declaration was the cornerstone of his defense before he had even hired a lawyer. In that single sentence, he reframed a cold-blooded assassination as an act of chivalry. He was not a murderer. He was a husband protecting his property. He was the avenger. As the police arrived and handcuffed him, Harry searched the crowd for Evelyn. She was in a state of shock, being escorted away by their companions. When Harry saw her, he called out, asking if she was all right, behaving as if he had just saved her from a burning building, rather than murdering her former lover in front of her eyes. The scene at the roof garden became a macabre spectacle. The body of Stanford White lay on the floor for some time before it was moved. Souvenir hunters, the morbid curiosity seekers of the Gilded Age, reportedly swarmed the area. dipping handkerchiefs in the blood or trying to steal pieces of the shattered glass. The murder of the century had instantly become a commodity. Harry was led out of the garden, passing the statue of Diana on his way to the police wagon. His demeanor in custody was forensically significant. He showed no remorse, no fear, and no confusion. He was lucid. He lit a cigar. He treated the police officers with the condescending politeness of a man who knows he will not be in their custody for long. He believed, with the absolute certainty of the Thaw millions, that he would be sleeping in his own bed within a few hours. The public execution of Stanford White accomplished exactly what Harry's diseased mind had intended. It erased the architect's power. In one moment, White went from being the untouchable creator of New York to a corpse on a dirty floor. Harry had forced the world to look at him. He had forced the gentleman who blackballed him to acknowledge his existence. However, the mechanism of the murder also revealed the depth of the rot within the American soul. The public reaction was split instantly. While the elites mourned White, a significant portion of the populace, fed by the tabloids, began to view Harry as a folk hero. They saw a man who had stood up to a powerful debaucher of young girls. The specific nature of the crime, a shooting in a theater, blurred the lines between reality and entertainment. The trial of the century had begun before the body was even cold, and the courtroom would become the next stage for the Thaw family's money to perform its dark magic. The night ended with Stanford White in the morgue and Harry K. Thaw in the Tombs prison, but the real violence was just beginning. The bullets were merely the prologue. The true weapon, the massive, distorted legal defense funded by Pittsburgh coal money, was about to be unsheathed. Harry Thaw had killed the man, but now his family would have to kill the truth. The trial of the century, Dementia Americana. The echo of the 3 gunshots at Madison Square Garden had barely faded before the second phase of the Thaw operation began. If the murder was an act of physical violence, the legal defense that followed was an act of intellectual violence, a systematic dismantling of the American judicial system funded by the limitless reserves of Pittsburgh coal money. The trial of Harry K. Thaw in 1907 became a prototype for the modern media circus, where truth is not discovered but purchased, staged, and sold. It was the first trial of the century, a term coined by the voracious press that descended upon the courthouse like vultures circling a carcass. But this was not merely a trial. It was a bidding war for the narrative of reality. And the Thaw family, led by the matriarch Mary Copley Thaw, arrived with the biggest checkbook. Mary Thaw did not view her son's incarceration as a consequence of his actions. She viewed it as a temporary administrative error that required correction. She mobilized immediately. She effectively seized control of the defense strategy, sidelining Harry's initial, erratic attempts to represent himself. Her strategy was simple and brutal: overwhelm the prosecution with resources. She hired a phalanx of the most expensive attorneys in the country, a dream team of the Gilded Age. But her masterstroke was the recruitment of Delphine Delmas, a flamboyant attorney from California, known as the Napoleon of the bar. Delmas was not hired for his knowledge of New York law. He was hired for his theatrical ability to hypnotize a jury. His fee was astronomical, reportedly $50,000 up front, a sum that would be worth millions today. The forensic challenge facing the defense was significant. Hundreds of witnesses had seen Harry shoot Stanford White. Harry had confessed immediately. The premeditation was obvious. He had carried a gun, stalked the victim, and fired at point-blank range. A standard defense was impossible. Therefore, the strategy had to shift from "did he do it?" to "why was he right to do it?" This required a delicate psychological pivot. The defense could not plead traditional insanity, because that would mean locking Harry away in an asylum for life, an outcome the Prince of Pittsburgh found unacceptable. Harry refused to be labeled crazy. He insisted he was a hero. The legal team, therefore, had to invent a new category of existence, a legal twilight zone where a man could be insane enough to kill but sane enough to walk free. Enter dementia americana. This term, coined by Delphine Delmas in his closing argument, stands as one of the most audacious legal fictions in history. Delmas argued that Harry was not suffering from a medical disease like schizophrenia or paranoia. Instead, he was afflicted by a species of insanity peculiar to the North American male. This condition, Delmas claimed, was a holy madness that possessed a man when the sanctity of his home or the purity of his wife was violated. Under the influence of dementia americana, a man became an instrument of divine justice. He was not a murderer, he was a protector. The killing of Stanford White was not a crime. It was the natural biological reaction of an American husband defending his woman's honor. It was a brilliant, cynical manipulation of the jury's Victorian prejudices. It reframed the narrative so that Stanford White was the criminal, the rapist, and Harry Thaw was the victim, the grieving husband. But to make this narrative work, the defense needed a witness who could testify to the ruin that had triggered Harry's madness. They needed the victim of the rape. They needed Evelyn Nesbit. This brings us to the transaction of silence. Evelyn Nesbit was the key to Harry's survival. Without her testimony detailing the abuse by Stanford White, Harry was just a jealous killer. With her testimony, he was a tragic hero. But Evelyn had no reason to help Harry. He had beaten her, humiliated her, and terrified her for years. She knew he was a monster. The Thaw family understood this, so they opened negotiations. Mary Thaw, who despised Evelyn as a low-class showgirl and blamed her for Harry's trouble, swallowed her pride and made a deal. The family promised Evelyn financial security for life. They promised a divorce settlement that would leave her wealthy and independent. They promised that if she took the stand and destroyed her own reputation to save Harry, she would be taken care of forever. It was a bribe wrapped in the language of family loyalty. Evelyn, young, destitute, and surrounded by the Thaw legal machine, accepted the deal. She agreed to become the sacrificial lamb. Evelyn's testimony was the climax of the trial. For days, the courtroom was packed to capacity, with thousands more rioting outside trying to get in. Women in the gallery brought lunches. Men stood on chairs. When Evelyn took the stand, she looked like a child, dressed demurely in a schoolgirl-style outfit chosen by the defense to emphasize her innocence. She proceeded to tell the story of the red velvet swing. For the first time in American history, the graphic details of sexual predation among the elite were aired in open court. Evelyn described the studio on 24th Street. She described the mirrors, the kimonos, the swing. She described the night of the champagne and the bitter taste. She described waking up naked with blood on the sheets. She described Stanford White's grooming, his manipulation, and his discarding of her. The effect was nuclear. The reputation of Stanford White was incinerated. The man who had been eulogized as a genius was instantly recast as a monster, a satyr who preyed on children. The jury and the public were horrified. The narrative worked perfectly. By exposing her own shame, Evelyn shifted the moral weight of the trial. The question was no longer, why did Harry kill him? But why didn't someone kill him sooner? However, the forensic toll on Evelyn was catastrophic. She was forced to relive her trauma in front of an all-male jury and a voyeuristic press. Every newspaper in the country printed her words. She was branded a ruined woman. She had saved Harry's life, but in doing so, She had destroyed her own social viability. She had become a fallen woman, a label that in 1907 was a social death sentence. The defense also weaponized Harry's mother. Mary Thaw sat in the front row every day dressed in black, projecting the image of the suffering, dignified matriarch. She represented the old money respectability that Harry lacked. Her presence reminded the jury that convicting Harry meant destroying a great American family. Behind the scenes, Mary's money was flowing like water. The defense team hired private investigators to dig up dirt on the jurors, to bribe witnesses, and to plant favorable stories in the press. The Thaw machine was essentially running a shadow trial alongside the legal one. The prosecution, led by District Attorney William Travers Jerome, tried valiantly to pierce the fog of dementia Americana. Jerome was a brilliant lawyer who saw Harry for exactly what he was, a spoiled, violent sadist hiding behind his wife's skirt. Jerome argued that Harry killed White not for honor, but for ego. He pointed out that Harry knew about the rape for years before the murder. Why wait? Jerome exposed Harry's own history of violence, his whipping of girls, his drug addiction. He famously asked the jury, "Is this the face of a hero or the face of a madman?" But facts were no match for the theater of Delmas and the tears of Evelyn. The first trial ended in a hung jury, 7 for conviction, 5 for acquittal. It was a partial victory for the Thaw money. The deadlock meant a second trial was necessary. The mechanism ground on. In the second trial in 1908, the defense shifted tactics slightly. They abandoned the dementia Americana label as too risky and settled for a straight plea of insanity. They argued that Harry was legally insane at the moment of the shooting. A brainstorm had overtaken him. The prosecution, exhausted and outspent, could not secure a conviction for murder in the first degree. The verdict came down, not guilty by reason of insanity. It was the result Mary Thaw had paid millions to achieve. Harry was spared the electric chair. He was spared life in prison. Instead, he was ordered to be confined at the Matteawan State Hospital for the criminally insane. To the public, this looked like justice. The killer was locked up. But forensic historians know that for a man like Harry Thaw, an asylum is not a prison. It is a hotel with doctors. Matteawan was a facility where money could buy privileges. Harry was given a private suite. He was allowed to order meals from outside. He had his own furniture. He was allowed to wear his own clothes. He effectively set up a court within the asylum, receiving visitors and managing his affairs. The verdict of the trial of the century was the ultimate triumph of the Gilded Age philosophy. The rich are different. They do not commit crimes. They have episodes. They do not go to prison. They go to hospitals. Stanford White was dead and buried, his legacy tarnished forever. Evelyn Nesbit was publicly shamed, her soul flayed open for the world to see. And Harry K. Thaw sat in a comfortable room in upstate New York, smoking a cigar, convinced that he had won. But the victory was a mirage. The Thaw machine had kept Harry alive, but it had not cured him. The madness was still there, festering in the luxury of his confinement. And the check that Mary Thaw had written to Evelyn Nesbit, the promise of a golden future, was about to bounce. The trial was over, but the betrayal was just beginning. The family had used the girl to scrub the blood off their hands, and now that the hands were clean, they were ready to wring her neck. The sacrifice and the betrayal, Evelyn's ruin. The verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity was the closing curtain on the legal drama, but it was merely the opening act of the Thaw family's domestic purge. With Harry safe from the electric chair and comfortably ensconced in the Matteawan State Hospital, the Thaw machine pivoted its targeting systems. The danger had passed, the witness had served her purpose. The forensic utility of Evelyn Nesbit was now exhausted. In the eyes of Mary Copley Thaw, the matriarch who held the purse strings, Evelyn was no longer the savior of her son. She was a loose end, a stain on the family linen that required aggressive bleaching. The betrayal of Evelyn Nesbit remains one of the most cynical chapters in the history of American wealth. During the trial, the Thaws had surrounded her with promises. They had assured her of financial independence, of a comfortable life in Europe, and of a divorce settlement that would secure her future. They had used her beauty and her trauma as human shields to deflect the lightning bolt of justice meant for Harry. Evelyn had believed them. She had stood on the witness stand, stripping herself of every shred of dignity, confessing to her own rape and humiliation to a room full of gawking men, all based on the belief that the Thaw family would honor their word. She was wrong. The moment the courtroom doors closed, the checkbook snapped shut. Mary Thaw initiated a strategy of starvation and slander. The monthly allowance that had been promised to Evelyn was abruptly cut off. When Evelyn's lawyers reached out to the Thaw estate, they were met with silence or legal obfuscation. The message was clear. We bought your testimony, not your life. The cruelty escalated with the birth of Evelyn's son, Russell Thaw, born in Berlin in 1910 while Evelyn was effectively in exile. Evelyn claimed and maintained until her death that Russell was Harry's son, conceived during a conjugal visit at the asylum, a privilege Harry's money had easily secured. Acknowledging the child would have given Evelyn a permanent claim on the Thaw fortune, a tether that Mary Thaw refused to accept. The family mobilized their legal army to deny paternity. Harry, showcasing his signature malice, publicly claimed that he was sterile due to a childhood illness, or alternatively, that he had never slept with Evelyn after the murder. He branded his own wife a whore and his potential son a bastard. Left destitute and abandoned by the family she had saved, Evelyn Nesbit was forced to cannibalize her own notoriety. She had no skills, no education, and her reputation in polite society was incinerated. She did the only thing she could. She went to work on the stage, but she was no longer the Gibson Girl model. She was the girl in the red velvet swing. She toured the vaudeville circuits of America and Europe, performing dance numbers and acting in plays that thinly veiled her own tragedy. The forensic reality of these performances is heartbreaking. Audiences did not come to see her talent. They came to see the woman who had caused a murder. They came to stare at the ruined beauty. She was a sideshow attraction, earning her living by allowing the public to pick at her scabs. The Thaw family looked on this spectacle with disgust, using it as further proof that Evelyn was low class, ignoring the fact that their financial abandonment had forced her onto that stage. While Evelyn struggled to buy milk for her son, Harry K. Thaw was living the life of a feudal lord inside the Matawan State Hospital for the criminally insane. His confinement mocks the very definition of incarceration. The asylum, located in Beacon, New York, was designed to hold dangerous lunatics. For Harry, it was a country club with barred windows. Harry's suite at Matawan was furnished with Persian rugs, mahogany furniture, and fine art. He had a personal chef. He ordered cases of wine and cigars. He was allowed to wear his own tailored suits. He held court daily, receiving friends, lawyers, and journalists. He essentially ran a shadow government from inside the asylum walls, using his mother's money to bribe guards and influence administrators. The mechanism of the payoff was still functioning perfectly. The doctors, charmed by his donations or intimidated by his lawyers, frequently reported that Harry was making excellent progress, despite his continued outbursts of rage and paranoia. However, the Prince of Chaos eventually grew bored of his gilded cage. In 1913, Harry decided that he had been punished enough. He did not file an appeal. He filed a flight plan. The escape of Harry Thaw on August 17, 1913, is a testament to the incompetence and corruption of the system. It was as easy as walking out the door. As the asylum gates were opened for a delivery truck, or, by some accounts, simply left unlocked by a bribed guard, Harry strolled out. He was met by a waiting car, a high-powered Packard, driven by a hired chauffeur. He jumped in, and the car sped off toward the Canadian border. This was not a desperate dash for freedom. It was a luxury tour. Harry stopped for lunch. He waved to people. When he crossed into Sherbrooke, Quebec, he was greeted by crowds who cheered him as a folk hero. The press, ever hungry for Thaw content, treated the escape as a romantic adventure. Harry K. Thaw, the killer and sadist, was once again the protagonist of the American narrative. He was eventually arrested in Canada and deported back to the United States, but not to prison. The Thaw machine went into overdrive. A new round of legal battles ensued, with lawyers arguing that Harry was now sane and should be released. In 1915, a jury, likely influenced by the same dementia Americana sentiment and perhaps other more tangible incentives, declared Harry K. Thaw sane and a free man. The monster was back on the street. Any hope that prison or the asylum had rehabilitated Harry was shattered almost immediately. The pathology of the sadist does not cure itself. It only goes dormant. Harry resumed his life of drifting, drug use, and violence. But the darkness had deepened. He was no longer just a spoiled heir. He was a man who believed he was invincible. He had killed the most famous architect in America and walked away. What could stop him now? The answer came in 1916, in a horrific echo of his past crimes. Harry was living in New York when he was accused of luring a 19-year-old named Frederick Gump into a hotel room. Gump was an aspiring student whom Harry had promised to sponsor, a mirroring of Stanford White's grooming tactics, but twisted by Harry's violence. Harry took the boy to a hotel, stripped him, and tied him to the bed. He then produced a whip. He beat Frederick Gump savagely, slashing his body until the boy passed out. It was a near-exact replay of the assault on the bellboy in London decades earlier and the torture of Evelyn Nesbit in the Austrian castle. The mechanism was identical, inflicting pain to achieve sexual release. When the beating was over, Harry tried to deploy the payoff. He offered the boy money, but this time the mechanism jammed. The Gump family refused to be silenced. They went to the police. They went to the press. The public, which had cheered Harry as the defender of female virtue in 1907, was revolted. The hero mask slipped, revealing the predator underneath. Harry fled New York, sparking a nationwide manhunt. When he was finally captured in Philadelphia, he attempted suicide by slashing his throat, a dramatic performative gesture that failed, leaving him with a scar but alive. This time, there was no dementia Americana. There was no Evelyn Nesbit to blame. The Thaw family, exhausted and embarrassed, finally conceded. Mary Thaw could no longer buy his freedom, only his comfort. Harry was declared insane again and committed to the Kirkbride Asylum in Pennsylvania. He would spend the next 7 years locked away, this time with slightly less luxury, though still far better than any common criminal. Meanwhile, Evelyn Nesbit's life continued its slow, agonizing disintegration. She drifted through failed marriages, struggles with morphine, addiction, a cruel irony, sharing the same vice as her tormentor, and suicide attempts. She opened a tea room, she taught ceramics, she wrote memoirs that tried to reclaim her narrative, but the world only wanted to hear about the murder. She was trapped in 1906, a ghost haunting a century that had moved on. The betrayal of Evelyn Nesbit is the moral black hole of the Thaw saga. She was the one person who had actually tried to save Harry, and she was the one person Harry and his mother destroyed with the most enthusiasm. They stripped her of her reputation, her financial security, and her dignity. They turned her into a punchline. In the forensic accounting of the Thaw dynasty, this betrayal reveals the true nature of their power. It was not just about having money, it was about the power to rewrite reality. They turned a murderer into a victim, and a victim into a villain. They used people like tissues, absorbing the mess and then discarding them. By the 1920s, the trial of the century was fading into history, but the wreckage was strewn across the landscape. Harry was in an asylum, whipping the walls. Evelyn was in a cheap boarding house, trying to forget. And Mary Copley Thaw sat in her mansion in Pittsburgh, an old woman surrounded by servants and silence, writing checks to lawyers, convinced to the bitter end that her son was a good boy who had just fallen in with the wrong crowd. The coal money had bought them everything except an exit from the hell they had built for themselves. The last whip, the dynasty's end. The kinetic energy of the trial of the century eventually dissipated, but the radioactive fallout of the Thaw scandal continued to poison the soil of the family tree for another 40 years. The dynasty did not collapse in a singular dramatic implosion like the stock market crash of 1929. Rather, it eroded. It was a slow, agonizing process of moral and financial oxidization, mirroring the rusting steel mills of Pittsburgh that had birthed the fortune. By the middle of the 20th century, the name Thaw had ceased to be synonymous with industrial power and had become a cultural shorthand for a specific kind of American rot. A cautionary tale of what happens when unlimited wealth meets unlimited depravity. Harry K. Thaw, the man who had shot the architect and whipped the bellboy, spent the second half of his life drifting through the margins of relevancy like a ghost in a linen suit. After his release from the Kirkbride Asylum in 1924, following the brutal assault on Frederick Gump, Harry found himself in a world that no longer feared him. The Jazz Age had arrived. The Victorian morality he had manipulated to justify the murder of Stanford White was dead, replaced by the cynicism of the Roaring Twenties. Harry was no longer the avenger of honor. He was an aging, eccentric relic with a bad reputation and a dwindling bank account. The mechanism of the family fortune had finally begun to sputter. Mary Copley Thaw, the iron matriarch who had funded the legal defense wars, fought a losing battle to keep the empire intact. The millions she had poured into lawyers, private investigators, hush money, and bribes had drained the liquidity of the estate. While the Thaws were still wealthy by the standards of the common man, they were no longer the titans they once were. The Pennsylvania Railroad, the source of their power, was facing its own decline as the automobile age dawned. The coal money was burning out. Mary died in 1939, leaving Harry the master of a shrinking domain. Without his mother's protective shadow, Harry's life descended into a pathetic routine of lawsuits and petty scandals. He was frequently sued by nightclubs for unpaid bills or by women claiming assault, though none generated the headlines of 1906. He became a litigious pariah, banned from the best hotels, forced to inhabit the second-tier resorts of Florida and Virginia. The forensic profile of Harry in his final years reveals a man consumed by the vacuum of his own personality. He never worked. He never created. He never contributed a single brick to the edifice of civilization. He simply consumed. He remained obsessed with the past, frequently retelling the story of the murder to anyone who would listen, always casting himself as the hero, unaware that his audience viewed him as a curiosity. The sadist was too old to hunt, so he subsisted on the memories of his kills. On February 22, 1947, the end came for Harry K. Thaw. He died in Miami, Florida, of a coronary thrombosis. He was 76 years old. There was no grieving widow at his bedside. There were no weeping children. He died alone, surrounded by paid nurses. The funeral in Pittsburgh was a stark contrast to the state affair of his father, William. It was sparsely attended. The city that William Thaw had built wanted nothing to do with the son who had disgraced it. Harry was buried in the family plot in Allegheny Cemetery, his body lowered into the same earth that had yielded the coal which paid for his crimes. The reading of his will was the final stinging crack of the whip. Harry left an estate valued at roughly $1 million, a shadow of the $40 million dynasty he had inherited. In a final act of spite, he left Evelyn Nesbit a bequest of $10,000. It was a deliberate insult. This was a fraction of the allowance he had promised her in 1906. It was less than he had spent on a single dinner party in Paris. It was a message from beyond the grave. You were worth nothing to me. And what of Evelyn Nesbit? The girl in the red velvet swing outlived her tormentor by 20 years. But she carried the scars of the Thaw dynasty until her last breath. After the betrayal by the Thaw family in 1908, Evelyn had been forced to navigate a brutal trajectory of survival. She had battled addiction to morphine and alcohol, mirroring the vices of the man who had ruined her. She had endured failed marriages and suicide attempts. She had been exploited by vaudeville promoters and tabloid journalists. Yet, forensic analysis of her later life reveals a resilience that Harry Thaw never possessed. Evelyn found a measure of peace in the creation of art. She moved to California and became a teacher of ceramics and sculpture. She stepped out of the spotlight and found solace in the clay, shaping something beautiful with her hands, an act of creation that stood in direct opposition to the Thaw legacy of destruction. In her final years, living in a nursing home in Santa Monica, Evelyn finally reclaimed her narrative. When interviewed by journalists who sought the salacious details of the murder, she refused to play the role of the vengeful wife. She spoke the truth that shattered the entire legal defense of 1907. She admitted that Stanford White, the beast Harry had murdered, was the only man she had ever truly loved. She described Harry not as a hero, but as a madman who had stolen her life. Stanny White was a great man, she told a reporter in the 1950s. Harry Thaw was a monster. This admission serves as the forensic closing statement of the case. The dementia Americana defense may have been less medicine than theater, an argument designed to sell a story, not settle a truth. The honor killing was a lie. The entire legal proceeding that had captivated the world was a fraudulent production funded by Mary Thaw's money. The murder can be read as jealousy, as obsession, as social rage. Yet whatever the label, the pattern of violence did not end with that rooftop. Evelyn Nesbit died on January 17, 1967 at the age of 82. She died penniless, but she died with her dignity reclaimed. The legacy of the Thaw dynasty today is a study in erasure. Unlike the Carnegies, who left libraries and universities, or the Mellons, who built galleries and banks, the Thaws left nothing. There is no Thaw University. There is no Thaw Foundation for the Arts. The name Thaw was quietly scrubbed from the institutions they once funded. The Allegheny Observatory, built with William Thaw's money, still stands, but the plaque bearing his name is a footnote, overshadowed by the infamy of his son. The black power of the coal empire evaporated. The mansion, Lyndhurst, was demolished, the land subdivided and sold off. The physical footprint of the family was erased from Pittsburgh, as if the city itself wanted to forget they ever existed. The only enduring monument to the Thaw family is the case law. The concept of the insanity defense in American jurisprudence was fundamentally altered by the Thaw trial. The cynical manipulation of psychiatry by the wealthy became a permanent scar on the legal system. The term brainstorm entered the lexicon, a precursor to the temporary insanity pleas that would appear in courtrooms throughout the 20th century. In the final analysis, the story of the Thaw dynasty is a grim verification of the corrupting power of inheritance without responsibility. William Thaw spent a lifetime building a mountain of gold. His son spent a lifetime turning it into a mountain of manure. The tragedy is not just the death of Stanford White or the ruin of Evelyn Nesbit. It is the absolute waste of potential. The resources that could have cured diseases, built schools, or advanced civilization were instead funneled into the veins of a drug addict and the pockets of defense attorneys. The 3 gunshots on the roof of Madison Square Garden were the loudest sounds the family ever made, but the silence that followed is far more deafening. It is the silence of a void where a legacy should have been. The Thaw dynasty ended as it began, in the dark. But this time, it was not the darkness of the coal mines, productive and rich. It was the darkness of a closed coffin, empty of everything except a rotting silk lining and a legacy that no one wanted to inherit. The last whip had been cracked, and there was nothing left to hit.